I had just graduated from college and got my first job in a new city. Being tight on cash, I limited my apartment search to cheaper parts of town, mostly on the outskirts. After about 2 weeks of searching on Craigslist, I found a place that was decently located and at my price point. It was a 3-story row house on a quiet street in the North End. It was hard to see the place in person, so I relied on pictures and a FaceTime call with the landlord, Ed, to see what it looked like. The place was all right, and Ed seemed friendly enough. All he asked for was a credit check, first month's rent, and a small security deposit to move in. A few days later, I signed the lease and packed my bags. At 22, I didn't expect much from my first apartment. Heck, I was just happy to have my own place and start adulting. But when I finally arrived, I got a very different impression of the house than I had on the FaceTime call with Ed. My room, which was on the first floor, looked a lot darker in person, mostly because the dark blue paint on the walls sucked up all the light. It also had a window that didn't look outside, but onto the laundry room. A black tarp covered most of the window, except toward the top. The kitchen was tinier than I thought, and a layer of grime caked the stove, refrigerator, and even the countertops. 2 other people lived in the house. Their names were Jason and Mike. Jason said he worked as a mechanic, and he was around my age. He lived on the 2nd floor and seemed pretty cool. Mike was around 50 and lived on the 3rd floor. But unlike with Jason, when I first met Mike in the narrow kitchen, things felt off. I told him where I was from and about my hobbies, but the entire time he'd only stare at me with an expression as cold as stone. When I tried to ask him about himself, all he'd give me were one-word answers. He said he did sales, which I had a hard time believing because he sure didn't strike me as the talkative type. Anyway, the conversation ended pretty quickly, and we both went back to our respective rooms. That night was a Sunday. It was approaching 11 p.m., and I lay in bed with the light off, checking my email on my smartphone. The entire house was still, until I heard footsteps coming down the stairs from the 3rd floor. I knew it had to be Mike. I listened as the footsteps gradually made their way to the ground floor. Then they came toward the kitchen, which my room sat adjacent to. At first, it seemed like this Mike guy was just going to the fridge for something. But instead, he stopped right in front of my door. I could see a shadow at the bottom, and he just stood there for what seemed like forever, like he was listening. Then he started mumbling something under his breath, except it wasn't just mumbling. It sounded as if he was chanting. A minute later, he walked away, back up the stairs to his room on the 3rd floor. Part of me wanted to confront him, but I figured I'd let it go because I didn't want to create unnecessary tension in the house. About a month passed. Every now and then I'd run across Mike, and he'd never acknowledge me. He'd just stare at me with his cold, gray eyes. I would smile a little and nod awkwardly, but I always winced inside when I'd run across him. One weekend in late October, my girlfriend Sandra came to visit me. We went downtown bar hopping on Saturday night, getting back home past 2 in the morning. We were both really tired, so we went straight to bed. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought I heard echoes of the house softly groaning in the wind. Then I suddenly awoke. Sandra was still asleep beside me, but a strange uneasiness gripped my entire body. That's when I heard it. A faint grumbling sound. A sound I'd heard before. I lowered my gaze from the ceiling to the window that led out onto the laundry room. And at the opening at the top, there were Mike's cold, dead eyes peering directly at me. I let out a sharp cry of panic, and at this, Mike withdrew himself from the window and ran up the stairs to his room. Sandra woke up terrified, and I told her what I just saw. But what could I do? Call the police? It would be his word against mine. So I decided it would be easier to just leave. I was on a month-to-month lease, so I moved out the next day and just paid the rest of the month. I stayed at an Airbnb for a few weeks till I found another apartment, but it wasn't easy. Even stranger than Mike's behavior was my landlord's reaction the next day. When I told him over the phone why I was leaving, he didn't sound surprised at all. He even chuckled to himself. I don't know what Mike's intent was, or if he and the landlord were in on something together, but I'm glad I got out of there before something more serious, or even tragic, happened.